Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Writer's Block, a short writer. Start again. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Writer's Block, a short web series where we discuss writing, tips for writers, tools for writers, specifically for Fordham University students, but for anyone in general. And today we're gonna, today Peter and I are gonna be talking about the uneven U, which is this sort of approach to writing paragraphs and argument that was developed by a scholar called Eric Hayot. And the uneven U really works based off of this impulse to kind of, it's not really paint by numbers, but systematize our writing in a way that makes it easier for us as writers and easier for readers to sort of digest the information. And so the core concept of the uneven U is this 5-point level system, in which the levels are related to a relationship to evidence. So in this system, you have levels 1 through 5, 1 being pure evidence. Now, evidence generally, when we talk about it in the sciences, would be, your raw data. Well, in the humanities, it tends to be quotes or historical documents and other kinds of sources that can't be wrong. They're open for interpretation, maybe, but the evidence itself kind of stands alone. And then you work your way up. So situating that evidence would be something like a level 2. Drawing multiple ideas together to make a context or a framework, that would be sort of a level 3. Finding a problem that's going on in there and problematizing or drawing into the deeper implications, that might be a 4. Where a 5 would be sort of offering a conclusion or why this matters in a larger sense sort of situation. And you can teach the uneven U focusing on these levels and doing a kind of paint by numbers thing, but that's not necessarily the best way about it. It's generally better to just think about how close your writing is to the evidence and how close you are to abstraction, things that are sort of founded on these things, but no longer really in contact with them. So those would be your level 5s. Peter, you got anything to say?
Oh, just that I like your description of the uneven U, and especially this idea that we don't need to hold to it exactly, right? It's more of a sort of a letter of the law versus the spirit of the law type thing. If making sure that each one of your sentences in a paragraph does line up with the numbers helps you to structure your paragraphs, go for it. If that bewilders you, then feel free to use it as a rough roadmap, not an exact science, if you will.
Absolutely. And actually the name of the uneven U it comes from this idea of a rough roadmap. And that is, if you were to chart out sentence number and these levels over the course of a paragraph or even a paper, it makes this uneven U structure. So I'm going to do a terrible job here. But what we've got here is like this very, very basic graph. And I can actually jump over and show you a better one.
Woo, visual aids.
Visual aids. So this is the core idea, that we have levels and they happen in specific places in our writing for us to best absorb information and to be the most persuasive. Typically, we start out around level 4, which is looking at some sort of problem, go into the teaching of the evidence that we need to understand that problem, and then going into the larger ramifications and moving back up this scale until we get to, well, here's how we solve the problem, or here's why this matters in a greater context. So naturally we have the start fairly high, dip down, and then work our way on back up. Now the difference between the 4 and the 5 at the start and end of your paragraph, that's all pure teaching that you're doing of your ideas. And that may not seem like a lot, but remember, when you're writing, oftentimes your reader doesn't know anything that is you're writing about, or why particularly they're reading what you're doing. So you kind of have to do this teaching along the way. And so that's what all these level 1s to 3s kind of do. They teach the heart of the matter.
And if you can remain here for just a moment, Kyle.
Sure.
What I always like to think about in terms of the uneven U is that when you're lingering at a 4 or a 5, you need the ones and twos to help unpack those ideas. And then when you're at the ones and twos, which are going to be your concrete images or quotes or examples, they can't speak for themselves. You need the more general extrapolation to unpack them. And so it's a really nice sort of ebb and flow where when you're at the 5s, you're always moving towards a 1, whether it's this paragraph or next. And when you're at a 1, you're always moving back into the higher numbers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I like the idea that the 1s and 2s are kind of like letting your reader come up for air. You know, it helps reground exactly what it is you're doing, why you're doing it. And when we're reading, these tend to be the parts that we skim over the most. If you notice, when you underline paragraphs or underline sentences in paragraphs, you typically underline the starts and the ends, not the data in the middle. Well, this is kind of where the uneven U comes from. It's not really a system that's imposed on writing. It's more recognizing something that we've already learned as writers, as academics, as humans in general, because this isn't something that only happens in writing, but also happens in speech.
Yeah, agreed.
So there's also this idea that the uneven U isn't particularly static. So what may be a 1 in your first paragraph might end up, you know, not even being touched in your later paragraphs. That is, you have one of these arcs, you reach a 5. Well, now that 5 serves as your level 4 for the next paragraph, and you kind of work your way on up. So there's a gradual rise in paragraphs over time as you make your point. And this is how you get into talking large abstract ideas, philosophical ideas, while seeming grounded. You've slowly built your way up along, like, you know, abstraction, a little bit more of evidence, abstraction, a little bit of evidence, abstraction, working your way to grander and grander ideas until you reach the point where you have an entire paper or even a book that's based off of these like core evidential bits, and then, you know, have small little loops down. So eventually, say by the time you're at paragraph 5 or 6 or 7, what would have been around a 1 might now be your 5 or your 5.
That's a great way to describe it, as sort of building to this crescendo. And yeah, I mean, if some people are great about thinking about their essays at the paragraph level, other people like to imagine them as more the whole document, multiple paragraphs. So that is a nice way to think about it, as rising.
So I thought we could look at a couple of examples. This first one, as I mentioned, we use the uneven U in speech, actually comes from a lecture by Alan Watts about myth. And this is a very early paragraph in this lecture. He's just done his basic introduction about myths. So Peter, would you mind just reading this out?
Sure. And these basic ideas I call myth, not using the word myth to mean simply something untrue, but to use the word myth in a more powerful sense. A myth is an image in terms of which we try to make sense of the world. And we are at present are living under the influence of two very powerful images, which are, in the present state of scientific knowledge, inadequate. And one of our major problems today is to find an adequate, satisfying image of the world. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to go further than that. Not only what image of the world to have, but how we can get our sensations and our feelings in accordance with the most sensible image of the world that we can manage to conceive.
All right. So we can kind of glimpse the general structure here. We have this setup. These basic ideas I call myth, but not using the word myth to simply mean untrue, but to use myth in a more powerful sense. Around where would you like put that, Peter, on the uneven U's 1 through 5 scale?
So I see phrases like basic ideas and then a more powerful sense, but I'm not sure what that means, a more powerful sense yet. And so this is definitely a sentence that needs to be elaborated. And so I'm going to put it around a 4 or a 5, just because it's quite general and then requires those specific details later in the paragraph.
Mm-hmm. It sort of acts as a promise for what we're getting in the rest of the paragraph. It's we're going to be talking about myth in a more powerful sense and maybe understand why it's more powerful. So yeah, definitely a 4. maybe a 3 if this was in a different place in the paragraph. If it was supporting some other point, it could work that way. But I think the next sentence is pretty clear. A myth is an image in terms of which we try to make sense of the world.
So I see that sentence, and it's a definition. It's something concrete. And so I know that's going to be at the other end of the spectrum, likely a 1 or a 2, depending on how you're defining those.
Yeah. Anytime we have sort of like a general is statement, we're really looking at a definition. And so this is his definition, as opposed to simply something untrue. We've gotten a new definition that we're going to need to understand what's coming next. So, and we at present are living under the influence of 2 very powerful images. Okay, bringing in not only the definition, but the reader. So that's 2 concrete things working together. We're working our way from a 2 maybe to a 3. We don't really know what these images are yet, so that'll probably be given to us later on in the essay, which are in the present state of scientific knowledge inadequate. Well, that's definitely new information. And one of our major problems today is to find an adequate, satisfying image of the world. So we've got like a recognition of an issue. This is getting to 4 territory, which then, you know, we're nearing the end of the paragraph. The 4 territory, we kind of want to push it a little bit further, say why that matters, and then that'll carry us through the next one, sort of drawing the reader forward.
If I may, Cathal, I'm going to read this last sentence again out loud, because I think it's a great example of seeing the uneven you at the end of a paragraph. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go further than that. Not only what image of the world we have, but how we can get our sensations and our feelings in accordance with the most sensible image of the world that we can manage to conceive. It's a great sentence. You might have to read it a couple times to understand it, because it's jam-packed with information, and it really it introduces a new concept, and it needs paragraphs to unpack. And so we know that we're back up into 4 or 5 territory, and we're going to need those 1s and 2s, presumably in the next paragraph, to better comprehend what he means here.
Yeah, Alan Watts does a lot of writing, and a lot of his speeches are in this sort of uneven U shape. But something else that we can just admire, aside from the uneven U, is that he doesn't use any language that we can't immediately understand. And so this is just, in my opinion, good writing from a number of different levels. You know, we understand every word in it. It's making a complex point, and it's promising us more and drawing us forward.
Yeah, great points.
So let's switch on over. You've provided us with your own little system drawn from the uneven U. And I think that's great, because anytime we're given a tool for writing, we can tailor it to our own specific demands or desires, what works best for us. Hayot gives us this 5-level structure, but at the same time, he says, don't be beholden to this. You know, these are rules that can be broken. And, you know, more important than understanding, is this a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, is how this relates to evidence, how this relates to abstraction, and how it's being used in your writing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your system and what it values?
Sure. So this is an example of writing just from a student paper, just a brief paragraph in a literary analysis. And I think that it's useful to take Hayot's system and simplify it, right? We always want to take tools and make them our own. And so for me and some of my students, 5 levels is a bit much. And so you can reduce it to 3, as I have at the top of the page here. 3 would just be general information, overview. You might often think of those in terms of topic sentences or concluding sentences. Number 2, that's where you're narrowing down a topic. So you're not providing granular evidence or graphs or images or quotes, but you are gesturing to more specific items than you would in a level 3 sentence. And then number 1 is just those examples, quotes, images, etc. And so this is sort of a poor man's version, if you will, of the more complex way of doing it. But if this works for you, feel free. Or if you'd like the 5 levels, use that as well. Why don't, if you wouldn't mind, Cathal, whenever you're ready, if you want to read through maybe just to the end of the quote that's on page 67 there.
Okay. So, before commencing with an analysis of the Anglophone novel after 1945, it is first necessary to understand generally how literary modernism influenced European and American culture throughout the first half of the 20th century. In particular, it is essential to consider the works of James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound. This trio of expatriate thinkers and writers are sometimes described as being part of the lost generation, which Louis Andover defines as a coterie of artists wayward and disoriented in the wake of World War I's unprecedented destruction, who in the 1920s took advantage of the flourishing intellectual scene and low cost of living in Paris.
Excellent. So if we move back up to that first sentence there, we know it's a 3 in overview. What do we see in that sentence, or why do we think that's a number 3 here?
Well, what we've got is, first of all, it sets the scene, Anglophone novel, 1945, and understand generally how literary modernism influenced European. So we've got like this basic kind of teaching going on. So definitely an overview, definitely general information.
Yeah, agreed. We're high off the ground there. We're looking at big picture things. Europe, America, 20th century Anglophone novel. A great place to start, but we know we're going to have to come down closer to the ground.
Yeah.
In this second sentence there, the author makes it easy for us. They begin in particular, and so we know we're moving from the general towards the particular, but we don't get any quotes or any specific data in that second sentence beyond simply gesturing to authors. So that's why we know that it's number 2.
It's definitely what we say is like a narrowing of the lens. You're kind of zooming in on one specific moment, one specific group of people. Then we've got this trio of expat thinkers are described as part of the lost generation, and that's obviously drawing directly from someone else's quote, right? Louis Andover. So we've got that. And we end here with The Lost Generation being credited to Gertrude Stein, though it first appeared in Hemingway's Movable Feast, which a Frenchman declares that the main characters are a generation perdue. And we see this sense of wayward lack of meaning throughout Hemingway's novels, as well as those of Stein and Pound. So if we were thinking about this from the uneven you perspective, this actually kind of doesn't reach those 4s or 5s afterwards. But sometimes that's okay. If we're doing basic teaching, if this paragraph is setting up another paragraph, which will continue on. So yeah, I can see the uses of this.
Excellent. And in these last 2 sentences here, I think it's important to note that you can have 2 sentences that are each a 1 follow one another, right? If it's necessary to provide 2 bits of information. And then we see in this last sentence a turning upwards towards the more general. And we know from that last sentence and from the first words of the paragraph, before commencing with an analysis of X, we must look at Y. We know that we are going to get an unpacking of these topics in the next paragraph.
Yeah, I'm actually very, if I was a reader, I would anticipate the next paragraph to be on those novels of Hemingway and Stein or Pound, just give us that exactly, so that it sort of signposts the reader, this is what's coming in the next paragraph, this is what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
All right. So, final thoughts on the uneven you.
Final thoughts. I mean, for me, so maybe to be blunt, like for me, it's sometimes nice when you're tired and you've got to churn out a paper and it's not your favorite topic and you just want to get a framework. You want to get some paragraphs on the page and then fill them in with the more interesting tidbits or the stuff that really jazzes you up. The uneven you is just a really solid framework.
Absolutely. I find myself using the uneven you a lot in theory, in that I'll write, when I'm writing a paper or doing a larger project, instead of thinking about sentences at the 1 or 2 level, I think about paragraphs at the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 level. And well, oftentimes you start writing something, you're interested in it, but you don't know exactly why. And you're kind of writing through your ideas. So I will oftentimes use the uneven U to start a project, but I won't start from 4. I'll start from my 1s and 2s and start writing about these specific things that these authors did, or that was going on in this historical moment. And because of that, I'm already dealing with them, bringing these complex ideas together, doing this little bit of teaching work for myself. I come to new ideas. And so, you know, instead of starting up here, I start down here and then work my way up and then rewrite the intro. So it's kind of like you can use it in your writing process without necessarily using it for every single paragraph, being prescriptive about it. It's just a tool, and however we want to use it, that's fair play.
That's a great point. I like this idea that you don't have, like, you're writing, you can come back and edit it later, you move things around, right? And so if you've got a phenomenal piece of evidence, start there and then write your way up that arc, as you said, and then fill in the front end later.
Absolutely.
And I also, before we go, one final note would be that when you're reading, right, when you're there in the library, you've got your highlighter, you're reading, and you just don't understand it, whatever it is, it's complicated in front of you. Oftentimes articles will follow the uneven U, and so you'll know at the beginning of paragraphs and at the end of paragraphs are probably those more general statements that might be more accessible than those middle of the paragraph deployments of evidence data. And so when in doubt, highlight those sentences because it's likely where the sort of the gist of the general idea is going to be.
Absolutely. It's also good advice for finals week and crunch time. If you don't have time to read every single sentence, read the fronts and ends. The last thing I wanted to mention is when we're doing, it's great that when we're writing, we can kind of like cut up the uneven U, do the process is different. When we're doing oral presentations or speeches, getting kind of into this flow of making our argument and then giving people a second to think about what you're saying by providing basic information, then coming back to your argument, these sort of ups and downs sort of reiterate your point. And so it's actually really great for oral rhetoric as well.
Yeah, agreed.
I think with that, we're going to end it. So hope you all have an awesome week and give the uneven U a try in your classroom or on your next assignment. All right. Take care.